Strange rules at a funeral home. Yeah, we're talking about strange things, strange rules that not only states have, but funeral homes specifically may have across all over the country. It's an interesting profession. I'm Nathan, spent 13 years in the profession, and we're going to dive right in. Like the rule that you must embalm a loved one the moment you receive them. It's not a rule for the state per se, but whenever I first started, the moment that a loved one died and you received them back at the funeral home, it didn't matter if you were up all night, 11 p.m., 1 a.m., 2 a.m., you embalmed the loved one if the family requested embalming. You couldn't refrigerate, even though you could refrigerate, or you couldn't repose them and get them what they call position. No, you tended to them at that moment. It's the old school approach and mentality. Yes, we tend to the dead immediately. I think it's a reverent thing to do. I think it's a disciplined thing to do. It's hard, nonetheless. It really is. But you also, in Alaska, you can't tie a loved one to the top of a vehicle to transport them. No, you cannot. Of course you can't. Like, there's a thing called a burial transit permit, and every state has one, or it's a provisional, if you want to call it that, too. The moment a loved one dies at Hospital A, you'd go to Hospital A, you get the paperwork that is associated with that loved one, and you bring them back into your care. It's a burial transit permit. It's required, and it goes to all the places in which the loved one goes, and then it goes to the cemetery or the crematory, and it's filed with the health department. Anyway, there is a guy who had an account of when he started in mortuary school, and he worked the night shift at the funeral home. Now, why he was at the funeral home overnight, I'm not sure. I do know that in the 60s and 70s, particularly even up to the 80s, a location that I worked at, they had a room where the directors on call would sleep in the room until they received the death call to go out overnight, and they listened to the scanner, and it's just evolved along the way. But nonetheless, this individual worked overnight, and his supervisor said to do specific things, like at 11 o'clock, place coins over the loved one's eyes. That is what Ebenezer Scrooge's partner had, who had to pay the toll, if you will. And this individual had to put coins over the eyes, I guess a superstition of this supervisor. And then the place was haunted, of course. And he said, if you hear a woman's voice, if you hear her crying or laughing or her talking, you need to go into the closet and lock yourself in until midnight. So a shift started at 11. And if between 11 and 12, you heard the voice, you would have to go in there until midnight. Very odd. There's another story where a guy was required when embalming, he was an embalming apprentice, that he was to tie with suture at the ankles, the loved one's ankles, to keep their legs straight, so they said. And then the joke evolved into, well, if they became a zombie during the apocalypse, they couldn't walk to get to you. Nonetheless, that's not a state rule. That is just a rule. It's not even being disrespectful to the deceased, because you want a loved one to repose straight in a casket. And oftentimes whenever a loved one dies, maybe they were under hospice care and they were propped a certain way because of the pillow, and they needed to have their legs straightened because it hadn't moved to be straight for quite some time. That is why they did it. There are other rules that are funeral home specific, like you cannot use a needle injector. No, you don't want to needle inject whatsoever. You only use suture, and suturing of the mouth. It is a more, I mean, it's foolproof. It's not going to come undone. And that is another video in and of itself. But back to this guy, he would have to walk by a specific room. He could not walk by another room, because if he walked by the other room, a parlor, a visitation room, then he would arguably see ghosts of a couple of people. This is in the funeral home. This is the supervisor telling this young apprentice, who I don't know if they're going to be an apprentice anymore. I don't know what happened after the fact. Like if I started and they're like, okay, you have to be here at 10 o'clock p.m. and you're going to stay here until 6 a.m. I mean, I've been on call overnight countless times, but I didn't sit at the funeral home all night long. I only went to the funeral home and I had a deceased loved one to drop off. This individual, I mean, he was quitted before he started. My gosh. So he couldn't walk by a particular room. I'm sure he did walk by. It's kind of like, don't push that button, and then he pushes the button. Did you know in Kentucky, you have to, by law, have a phone to have a funeral home open? You can't even operate a business. You can't even operate a funeral home business without a phone, because that's how you receive death calls, is the phone. You have to have a full-time office in the state of Iowa. Thanks, Iowa, for holding us accountable. Some states only require you to have an associate's degree. Some states don't even require a license of any kind to be an embalmer, like Colorado, who had many cases against them because of finding 129, 131 bodies, like people selling body parts. You, right now, you could go to Colorado, build a garage, put a crematory in it, put a table in it, and start saying, yeah, I'm a funeral home and crematory, and you just come here and offer discounted services, never having embalmed a loved one in your life. It's true. Probably even use like Dr. Pepper for the embalming fluid. Please don't do that. This is totally a joke. It's a reverent service. It's a needed service. Let me know in the comments below if you know of any rules, laws, regulations at your state for the funeral profession. Go dive into Reddit for me and let me know in the comments. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell to be notified when I release content exclusive to YouTube here. This thing keeps bouncing up and down. I'm so grateful and excited for all the stuff that's happening in my life. My songs are inspired by my works. This profession is a beautiful one, and it needs to be shared, and that's why I'm here. Last Time is streaming on Friday, and we'll see you at the next one. Goodbye.